He married an obese alien to escape poverty and win a spaceship, but she locked him in. The registration office smelled of recycled air and recently broken dreams. Iqbal had been in enough government buildings to recognize the smell, that particular institutional flatness, as if the ventilation system had filtered out not just allergens, but also ambition, joy, and the faint possibility that things might improve. He sat on a plastic chair designed by someone who had never sat on a plastic chair, holding a sheaf of forms he had read 4 times, and waited for his name to be called in a room full of people doing the same. Most of them were human, 2 were not. The not-humans were Vorranu, and Iqbal had been studying the Vorranu for 3 years, long enough to know that what you saw first was never the whole picture. What you saw first, with Vorranu, was size. The one seated across the registration hall was enormous, not in the human sense of someone who had eaten their feelings for several consecutive decades, but in the sense of a geographic feature. She occupied a space the way a hill does, with absolute calm, with the implication that she had been there for some time and would remain. Her skin was the color of deep river sediment, layered in gradations from dark gray at her shoulders to something almost amber at the broad planes of her wrists. She wore cloth the color of old copper, and the cloth was good, not decorative. Good. There is a difference, and Iqbal, who had grown up wearing other people's good cloth second-hand, knew it immediately. She was looking at him. He looked away, looked back. She was still looking at him. He looked at his forms. "Iqbal Beg," said the desk worker, and Iqbal stood, straightened his jacket, his one good jacket, worn to the shine of a coin, and walked to the counter. The contract was 7 pages. He had read all 7 pages. He had a translation certificate, level 3 Vorranu, and he had translated the ceremony notes himself 2 weeks ago when the agency first proposed the match. Contract marriages between humans and Vorranu were not new. The Interspecies Commerce Act had made them possible 6 years ago, structured as legal partnerships with benefit sharing on both sides. The human received residency aboard a Vorranu vessel, and a share of any commercial gains registered to that vessel during the contract period. The Vorranu received, in this case, a licensed translator with documented proficiency in 3 Vorranu dialects, fluent enough to be useful in trade negotiations, but crucially, not a citizen of any of the 4 merchant coalition worlds that would have made him a conflict of interest. What the Vorranu received, in other words, was Iqbal. What Iqbal received, if the contract ran its full term, and the ship made the gains projected in the annex, was enough money to pay off 11 years of accumulated debt, plus a clause that specified 1 working vessel of minimum class 7 to be allocated by lottery from decommissioned merchant stock. A spaceship. He was here to marry a stranger for a spaceship. He was aware this was not his finest hour. He was also aware that his finest hours had not, historically, produced much. He signed. The ceremony itself was brief. Iqbal had prepared for the formal exchange, had memorized the Vorranu phrases, had practiced the correct register of voice, which sits lower than a human expects and carries its weight in the last syllable. He said his part correctly. The registrar, a tired human woman who had clearly done this several hundred times, stamped 4 copies and handed him 2. He turned to face his new wife. She was closer than he'd expected. The Vorranu moved quietly for their size, the way a river moves quietly until you notice it has been moving all along. She stood, she filled his field of vision, simply, the way a building does when you step off a bus. He extended his hand. She went still. Not the stillness of someone who doesn't understand the gesture. The stillness of someone who is doing something else entirely with her body, something deliberate, something that has the quality of an act. 30 seconds passed. He kept his hand out. It began to feel absurd, then ceased to feel anything, then became simply a fact about him. A man with his hand out in a registration office married. She had been reading him. He learned this later from the ship's library. The Vorranu greeting *Vethsara* is not performed in motion. It is performed in stillness. You hold your position and allow the other person to see you clearly without the noise of movement to confuse the picture. You are saying, "Here is what I am. Look properly." He had offered his hand. She had offered herself. He hadn't known the difference. He dropped his hand. She inclined her head, a Vorranu nod, which involves the whole upper body and has the quality of a bow without the servility of one, and said, in careful standard, "I am Osavel. The ship is docked at Bay 9. I will show you." She had a voice like the lowest register of an organ played in a room with good acoustics. Not loud, present. "Right then," said Iqbal. Bay 9 was not a small bay. The asterisk Sovereign Endurance was not a small ship. Iqbal had known this from the registration files, had seen the dimensions listed in columns of numbers that meant nothing until he walked into the docking arm and saw the ship's hull stretching away in both directions, and felt his body do the small recalibration it does when a thing turns out to be real. The hull was dark bronze, paneled in overlapping sections like scales, each one etched with what he would later learn were Osavel's route records. Every journey the ship had made, pressed into metal as permanent record. She had been flying this ship for 40 years. The hull was dense with marks. She showed him his quarters, a room off the main corridor, small by the ship's proportions, generous by his. He had lived in worse rooms and paid more for them. "The contract specifies your access to common areas," she said, standing in the doorway because the room did not accommodate them both. "The bridge, the gallery, the cargo holds during transit, the library. My quarters are the aft section. You will not go there without invitation." "Of course," he said. "The ship systems are in Standard and Vorranu. I can arrange for a primer on the Vorranu interfaces if—" "I can manage," he said. "I read the technical dialects." She looked at him steadily. "The agency said level 3. I taught myself 4. A pause. He didn't know why he said it. Something about being in a room he hadn't earned yet, in a jacket worn thin at the elbows, feeling the way he had always felt when he had to prove the thing he already knew. The agency tests to level 3. She considered this. Then she turned and led him back down the corridor, and he followed. And she showed him the bridge with its curved panels and the gallery with its long windows that looked out onto the station and the dark beyond, and the library which smelled of the Vorranu equivalent of old paper, something mineral and dry. And finally she stopped at a junction in the corridor and said, "I have departure procedures to complete. The ship leaves at 1400. "Leaves for where?" he said. "The Harvin Way station, 2 days transit." She looked at him. "It is in the contract." "The annex, yes, I read it. I meant today we leave today." "Yes." He absorbed this. He had a bag in his quarters. He had packed for a ship. He had not packed for today specifically, had thought there would be a period, a settling in, an orientation, some human-paced adjustment, but this was, he reminded himself, a Vorranu ship, and the Vorranu experienced time at their own pace and had presumably experienced all the adjustment they needed and were now ready to continue. "Right then," he said. At 1400, he felt the docking clamps release through the floor. He was in the gallery when it happened, watching the station lights slide sideways past the window as the asterisk Sovereign Endurance eased out of Bay 9. The station grew smaller in the frame. Then the frame was full of nothing but dark and stars. He went to find Osavel. She was on the bridge, seated in a Vorranu pilot's cradle, a wide, low construction that looked less like a seat and more like a country, surrounded by a curved array of panels showing navigational data in a dialect he recognized but had not read in some time. She did not look up when he entered. "The docking lock," he said. "Yes," she said to the panels. "I noticed it engaged." "It did." He waited. "When does it? When would it disengage?" She looked up then. Her eyes were the amber of old resin and she did not hurry the look. "At Harvin Way Station, in 2 days." He stood very still. The way you stand when you're making sure you understand a thing before you let yourself feel anything about it. I can't leave the ship. During transit, no. This is standard for all Vorranu vessels with legal passengers aboard. It is, she paused, and he watched her select the word, a safety protocol. It's in the contract. She returned her attention to the panels. Yes. He went back to his quarters and sat on the edge of his bunk and looked at his hands, which were extremely familiar to him and offered nothing useful. He thought about his flat, which was not his flat anymore. He had given up the lease, because you didn't keep a Bradford Council flat while living aboard a registered interstellar vessel. The forms didn't allow for it. He thought about his outstanding debts, which were the reason he was here, which were the reason the flat had been barely affordable anyway. He thought about his mother, who he had called yesterday, who had said at least you'll have security asterisk, which had been the most optimistic thing she had said to him in 11 years. He thought about the space, the size of a spaceship between him and the door. He did not think about being frightened. He thought instead about the lock, which was a metal mechanism which had 2 days on it, which was a problem with a defined end. He was good at those. He found his travel kettle at the bottom of his bag, filled it from the gallery's water point, and set it to boil. The exit clause was in Section 14, subsection 3, paragraph 8. He found it at 6 in the morning, ship time, sitting cross-legged on his bunk with the contract spread across his knees and a cup of tea going cold beside him. He had read the clause the night before and understood it as a legal formality, a human custom, a procedural valve. Either party may invoke the termination protocol within the first contract cycle, provided the request is submitted in writing to a registered mediator within the first 30 days. 30 days. He had 30 days to invoke it. The problem was the second sentence, which he had read, but he saw this now, in the particular sharp-edged clarity of early morning and insufficient sleep, had processed through his translation brain rather than his understanding brain. The second sentence specified that the termination request must be received and acknowledged by a registered mediator who is physically present on a neutral station. Harvenway Station was not neutral. It was a Vorranu merchant hub. He took his cup of tea and went to find Osavel. She was in the gallery, which surprised him. He had assumed she was the kind of person who worked through the night and slept in brief, efficient intervals. But here she was, seated at the long table, with something in front of her that might have been food. A wide, flat dish containing a dark paste and what appeared to be seeds arranged in a pattern that was probably not decorative. She did not look up immediately. He had been on the ship long enough just to understand this was not rudeness. He waited. After a moment she looked up, and he sat down across the table. Section 14, he said, subsection 3. Yes, she said. The exit clause specifies a neutral mediator on a neutral station. Yes. Harven is not a neutral station. She was quiet for a moment. She had a quality of quiet that was not empty, it was weight-bearing. No, she said, it is not. The next neutral station on the annex route is, he had looked this up, Pelham Crossing, which is 11 months into the route. The *keth* cycle, she said. He looked at her. I'm sorry. She set down her dish very carefully, in the way of someone putting down something that matters. In Vorranu contract law, she said, a promise of significance cannot be reviewed until one *keth* cycle has passed. The *keth* cycle is the period in which a promise becomes part of the body, part of what we carry. She paused. 11 months, approximately, in standard reckoning. He sat with this. He was good at sitting with things. Years of debt and diminished options had made him so. You knew this when I signed. Yes. I did not know this when I signed. She looked at him steadily. Your translation of the contract ceremony was correct in every particular, she said. You translated it well. I translated the words, he said. I didn't know the law underneath the words. Something shifted in her face, Or perhaps it was a change in her bearing, which was where the Vorranu kept their expressions. "No," she said, "you did not." He stood, because the alternative was sitting here feeling something he didn't have the vocabulary for yet, and he was not going to do that at the table of someone who had, without malice and without deception, and with every legal instrument intact, enclosed him in a ship for 11 months. He went to the water point. He filled his kettle. He brought it back and boiled it and made a cup of tea. And he didn't know why he made a second cup. He set it in front of her. She looked at it. He sat down and drank his own. She picked the cup up. He watched from the edge of his vision, not watching. She held it in both hands. Her hands were enormous, broad-palmed, the knuckles the color of pale stone, and she did not drink. She sat with the cup held against her chest, below her chin, the steam rising in a thin column between them. 20 minutes. He knew because he counted, not deliberately, just because he was someone who counted things when he was unsettled. She held the cup for 20 minutes and did not speak and did not drink, and he finished his tea and looked out the gallery window at the dark that was the same in every direction. He thought, she is doing something with that cup. He did not know what. He filed it away. "What do you actually need from me?" he said eventually. "Not the contract language. What do you need?" She set the cup down. "There is a merchant guild meeting at Harvin, 3 sessions of negotiation. The opposing party's lead speaker is fluent in Standard and 2 Vorranu dialects." She looked at him. "Not 4. He looked back. "You want me to find the gap?" "I want you to translate," she said carefully. "What you find in the translation is your own matter." A pause. "Right then," he said. He picked up her untouched tea and drank it himself, because it was going cold, and that seemed a waste, and she watched him do this with an expression he could not read, but that did not appear to be offense. He went back to his quarters and read the guild meeting briefs she had left in his library queue, and at some point he fell asleep with the documents open, which was not the dignified entry into a new phase of his life that he had vaguely imagined, but was, he supposed, accurate. Harvin Way Station hung at the edge of the Vorranu meridian route like a knot in a string, the place where 3 trade lines crossed and paused and distributed their cargo before moving on. It was large, by station standards. It was busy, by any standard. Iqbal stood on the boarding ramp of the * Sovereign Endurance and watched the Vorranu move through the docking concourse below, and felt the particular feeling of someone whose job is about to begin. He was, he reminded himself, good at his job. The negotiations were held in a room that smelled of the mineral dry scent he was learning to associate with Vorranu formal spaces, something like chalk, something like very old wood. The opposing merchant's name was Drevas, and Drevas was not old by Vorranu reckoning, lean by Vorranu reckoning, which meant experienced but not elder, which meant ambitious but not yet settled into the patience of the large. Drevas had 3 assistants and a lead speaker named Veth, who opened the session in excellent standard and then switched to first register Vorranu for the contract reading, which was the standard diplomatic move. Complement your counterpart's language, then conduct business in your own. Iqbal sat beside Osavel and listened. He was a good listener. He had been a good listener since he was 7 years old and realized that the people in rooms like his family's kitchen talked around the things that mattered, and that if you listened to what sat beside the words, you could sometimes understand what couldn't be said directly. He had taken this skill to languages, because language was just that, the words that said a thing, and the words that sat beside it, and the gap between them where the meaning lived. He listened. The contract was for route rights, a specific transit corridor across the Harvin meridian that Osavel's clan had worked for 60 years. Drevas's party wanted co-rights, which was different, and the distinction lived in a single compound term in 3rd Register Vorranu, Vethanu *, which their lead speaker was translating as shared access. It did not mean * shared access. Iqbal leaned slightly toward Osavel. He kept his voice below the level of the room's acoustics, below the level of a whisper, the level of a word said without moving. Vorranu, he said. They're translating it as shared access. She did not look at him. It means absorbed access, he said. Co-rights with primacy assigned to the second party by default, with the first party required to file for each transit separately. He paused. It's not sharing, it's transfer. She was still. Then very slightly, she shifted her weight, a Vorranu movement so small it wouldn't register to someone not watching, but Iqbal was watching because that was his job. She raised one hand. The session paused. I would like to note, she said, in standard, which was itself a statement, the choice to use the neutral tongue in a room full of Vorranu speakers, that I have concerns about the translation of Clause 7, Term 3. She did not look at Iqbal. I would invite the opposing party to offer an alternative rendering of *Vorranu that accounts for its third register legal usage. The room was quiet. Drevos looked at his lead speaker. His lead speaker looked at the contract. The scars on Drevos's forearms, those visible record marks of failed agreements, dark lines pressed into pale gray skin, were, Iqbal noticed now, too uniform, too evenly spaced, too similar in depth. He had seen real Vorranu contract scars in photographs during his studies, and they varied because agreements vary because some cost more than others and the body records the difference. These were the same depth, the same width. Decorative, he thought, which meant invented, which meant Drevos was presenting a history of negotiations he had not had. He did not say this. That was not his translation to make. He said nothing. He had said the one thing. He watched Osavel sit with it, hold it, build with it. The session recessed for 40 minutes. When it resumed, Drevos's party had amended Clause 7. On the way back to the ship, walking through the concourse with its noise and its crowds and its smell of fuel and food, and the particular mineral note of many Vorranu in a small space, Osavel said nothing. She walked beside him at the pace of someone who has walked everywhere and will continue to walk, and he kept up with her and said nothing either, because he had learned in 2 days that silence beside a Vorranu was not a gap to be filled. At the ramp she stopped. You noticed the scars, she said. He looked at her. Yes. You said nothing about them. That wasn't the translation. She was quiet for a moment. Then, no, it was not. She went aboard, he followed. That evening he made tea. He sat in the gallery and watched something vast and cold and beautiful move past the porthole without stopping, a body of some kind, dark stone, trailing light along one edge the way a knife trails water there, and then gone. He didn't know what it was. He wrote a note to look it up in the library and then didn't, because he was tired in the way of someone who has done a precise thing correctly and felt it land, and that particular tiredness wants nothing but to sit quietly and let the dark move past. In her quarters, he did not know this, could not know this, would not know it for some months. Osavel was writing in her log. One line in Vorranu. He kept the promise he did not know he had made. The ship moved on through the dark, and Iqbal made more tea, and outside the porthole something vast and cold and beautiful went past without stopping.